It's another staggering turn of events. The head of the COVID inquiry threatens to fine members of the Cabinet Office or even send them to prison if they don't hand over Boris Johnson's WhatsApp messages. The former Prime Minister has sacked his government lawyers after they already handed in his private diaries to the police, but is demanding taxpayers stump up for his private ones. It is quite the row tonight. Also on News at 10. Rock legend Tina Turner very sadly dies at the age of 83. Inflation is down but still running at an eye-watering 8.7%. Furious criticism tonight from the family of the woman killed by Sophie Wessex's outrider. Can he beat Trump to the Republican nomination? It's official, DeSantis is standing. And how AI has helped a paralyzed man to walk again.
Within 5 to 10 minutes, the brain implant picked up what I was doing with my hip, so that was like the best outcome.
This is ITV News at 10 with Tom Bradby.
Good evening. Even in the colourful back catalogue of Boris Johnson run-ins with the authorities over Partygate, never has there been a row quite like this one. The eminent former judge leading the COVID inquiry, set up to find out how the government handled the pandemic, is tonight threatening to send members of the Cabinet Office to jail. She says they must hand over complete versions of the former Prime Minister's diaries and WhatsApp messages, or else. The government department had claimed some should remain secret because they clearly were irrelevant. Baroness Hallett wasn't having any of that. I decide what is relevant, she said in effect, so hand everything over. In another twist, and perhaps not surprisingly, Mr Johnson has sacked the lawyers who handed over his diaries to the Cabinet Office for inspection, only to find they were then passed on to the police, apparently over previously unknown gatherings. Yes, more of them at both Downing Street and Chequers. He is seeking new lawyers of his own, though he'd like us all to pay for them.
Boris Johnson's a busy man, touring the US and looking for new lawyers. He fired his old lawyers after information they dug up found its way to the police. His new team will still be taxpayer funded, though not everyone thinks it should be.
Why is the Prime Minister forcing the British public to foot the bill?
It's actually a long established process across multiple administrations that former ministers are supported with legal representation after they have left office to deal with matters that relate to their time in office.
At the same time, there's been an extraordinary bust-up over Boris Johnson's pandemic diaries and WhatsApp messages. The COVID inquiry wants to see them all. The government is refusing to hand over everything. The Cabinet Office telling Inquiry Chair Baroness Hallett the inquiry has no power to use its compulsory powers to demand material that is unambiguously irrelevant to its work. But the Baroness reminded the government that failure to comply with her request could land someone in prison. She said the Cabinet Office had misunderstood the breadth of her inquiry, writing, "The entire contents of the documents that are required to be produced are of potential relevance to the lines of investigation that I am pursuing."
There's no point in setting up an inquiry like this and then having a standoff over information. The inquiry has to have access to the information it needs, and that means to me the government will have to give the inquiry the information it's asking for.
Two police forces are still considering whether some of that information about visitors to Chequers and Downing Street should be investigated. Team Johnson say the visits were all legal, and his supporters are suspicious as to why the police were asked to look at them.
It's very bizarre what's going on here. I think a lot of people are starting to ask questions about what is simply, what is it people have got against Boris? Because ultimately, whether people wanted him to be or not wanted him to be, he's no longer the Prime Minister.
Boris Johnson's next US speaking engagement is at the Bellagio Hotel and Casino later. It is said that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, but what happens in government WhatsApp groups can be harder to contain. Carl Dinnan, News at 10, Westminster.
And Robert joins us from his studio where he has been recording his programme for tonight. Do stay on watch it after this. Robert, in the meantime, can I just ask you about this? I mean, people are going to be wondering, why have Boris Johnson's diaries been sent to the police? Is he realistically in trouble or not?
Yeah, I definitely think that this is a bit of a headache for the Prime Minister and indeed for the... the former Prime Minister, and indeed for the whole Tory party, because, you know, Rishi Sunak wants people reminded of the sort of Partygate scandal like he wants a hole in the head. Now, I just want to know, before I get back to that, just say one thing relating to this incredible row, which you pointed to, between Boris Johnson and the government on the one side and the COVID inquiry on the other, over the fact that they want the uncensored Boris Johnson WhatsApps, and, you know, the government's refusing to hand those over. I think the government's in a very sort of difficult position, on a sticky wicket, given that the former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, handed all of his relevant WhatsApps over to a private individual who then gave him the Daily Telegraph, and the former Health Secretary is saying he wants all of his uncensored to go to the COVID inquiry. So it's slightly ridiculous, some would say, that the government won't do the same with Boris Johnson's. Now, the reason why the police have got these diaries is because the lawyers who were representing Boris Johnson came across these diary entries relating to gatherings in Chequers and indeed in the Downing Street flat, thought they looked dodgy, thought they might well have been breaching the COVID rules that said that these sorts of gatherings shouldn't be taking place, gave them to the Cabinet Office under the Civil Service Code. If there's any suggestion that the law has been broken, they have an obligation simply to hand over relevant information to the police. And that is what happened, and that's why Boris Johnson is so furious. He says this is some kind of civil service conspiracy. The civil servants are referred to in this denigratory way as the blob. He thinks this is the revenge of the blob against him. I talked to, on my show tonight, Ken Clarke is on the show, former Chancellor, very you know, what we might call a Tory grandee. I said, is this the revenge of the blob? He said, absolutely not. The problem with Boris Johnson is he doesn't know how to follow the rules.
OK, Robert, thank you very much indeed. And do, as I say, stay up and watch Robert's show just after this. Now, the thinking about inflation had been that the rocketing prices would slow down quickly a year after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which, of course, had pushed them all up. Yet, weeks on, inflation is still running at 8.7%. Off the peak, yes, and below double figures for the first time since last August, certainly, but spooking the markets all the same. The latest figures show that in stubbornly high food prices and in the rising cost of services like mobile phones, inflation is well and truly embedded in the economy, which makes a couple more rises in interest rates seem likely.
Inflation is falling, but the cost of food and fresh vegetables in particular continues to rise at a brutal pace. On global markets, wheat, dairy and oil prices have eased. Farmers, manufacturers and supermarkets are now under pressure to pass on savings as soon as they can.
We all need to make sure that as these prices come down, the benefit is fed through to consumers, to people doing their weekly shop as quickly as possible.
The headline annual rate of inflation fell sharply to 8.7% last month, largely because energy bills, which went up by an awful lot last year, have risen by much less this year. But the worry is what's called core inflation, which strips out energy and food prices. It rose unexpectedly in April to 6.8%. That's more than 3 times the bank's target rate and the highest level in 31 years. Mobile phone companies and water companies hiked their prices. The price of computers, televisions, second-hand cars and driving lessons also rose sharply. Services inflation rose too in April, and all these are signs that price rises in the UK are widespread across the economy.
The market reaction was immediate. The Bank of England has already raised interest rates to 4.5%. Investors now think bank rate will clear 5% in the months to come.
Inflation today was much higher than expected, and it was higher than expected last month and the month before that as well, and is still well above the 2% target. And interest rates are still likely to be going higher, and I don't think they'll be coming down anytime soon. So really, this is going to be a long, painful process.
Now is not a great time to be running a restaurant. Kingdom Tenga owns 3 in Chester. His costs are still rising, so he plans to increase his prices again.
We're paddling like hell, and I just think as much as we're trying to be conscious of people's spending habit, we also want to survive. And for us to survive, we might have to put 2% or 4% just to cover the costs.
Here in Chester, inflation is now feeding on itself. This is the cycle the Bank of England is trying to break. Higher interest rates is the tool it is using to do it.
And Joel is here to talk about all this. Look, this is pretty miserable for an awful lot of big people. Why is the UK lagging behind?
Well, it's a bit troubling. I think until recently, Tom, we should remember that the expectation was interest rates would really fall quite quickly this year. Not only are they falling more slowly than the Bank of England has repeatedly predicted, they are falling more slowly in the UK than in other G7 countries. And we're paying a price for that, in the sense that everyone in the UK, households, businesses, even the government, it will cost everyone more to borrow money. Higher interest rates now look inevitable. During the course of the day, yields on UK government bonds, remember them, shot back up to the levels that we last see just after Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng's disastrous mini budget last September. Inflation is proving sticky, but there are reasons why. In a sense, the UK's had the problems that the United States has had, in that people have left the workforce either through retirement or ill health. We've also had all the problems that European countries like France and Germany and Italy have had in this kind of surge of energy prices. So we've had almost the worst of both worlds. Now, according to researchers at the London School of Economics, Brexit's also been a factor. They calculate British households have paid an extra £7 billion to cover the extra cost of trade barriers on food imports from the EU, forcing up prices further. Pressures from all directions.
OK, Joel, one day I'm sure it'll be a happier picture, but for now, thank you very much indeed. Tina Turner's voice, her lyrics and her life story have always been unmistakable. She was, after all, the undisputed Queen of Rock. But this evening came the announcement that this life story had very sadly come to an end at the age of 83. Hers was a career of reinvention and record-breaking sales, of vocal passion and on-stage energy. She was, as the many reflections on her life have reminded us tonight, simply the best.
You must try to ignore that it means more than that. Oh, what's love got to do with it?
Playful, powerful, a performer like no other.
You're simply the best, better than all the rest.
Tina Turner sang for 60 years, selling 100 million albums, earning an icon status.
I think it's gonna work out fine.
She found fame alongside her husband Ike in the 60s, though she would later divorce her abusive partner.
Ike was a violent person, and at that point he was on drugs, very insecure, and I had no money, I had no place to go, but I just took a chance. I said the way out is through the door.
I'm your private dancer, a dancer for money.
As a solo artist, she found even greater success, becoming the queen of rock and roll. Tina would go on to win 8 Grammy Awards and earn the adoration of fans around the world. Paying tribute, Bryan Adams said, "I'll be forever grateful for the time we spent together on tour, in the studio and as friends." While Mick Jagger reminisced about Tina, saying she was inspiring, warm, funny and generous. "She helped me so much when I was young, and I will never forget her." Her life inspired a biopic and later a West End show. Those at tonight's performance remembered both Tina's character and her music.
It's everything. It binded me and my mum. It binded me and my mum together. Do you know what I mean? When I was younger, we used to clean the house and cook and stuff together to Tina Turner.
Her story, like the domestic violence, is she's a very strong character, isn't she? And so inspiration, I imagine, for lots of women, for lots of different reasons.
We grew up listening to her music, so she's an American icon.
Friends described Tina as one of a kind, a star that shone brightly right until the end.
Truly the one and only Tina Turner. Now, the police in South Wales are sticking to their story that two teenagers on an electric bike were not being chased by a police vehicle at the moment the boys crashed the bike in Cardiff and sadly died. More home security videos do show a police van following boys on a bike. Police said today CCTV images were filmed a good minute before the crash and half a mile from the scene. Kyrie Sullivan and Harvey Evans had been best friends all their lives. The Deputy Chief Constable of South Wales said the officers in the van had not been interviewed under caution. To the latest now on the cross-border attack into southern Russia by anti-Putin forces who want to reclaim their country. At a news conference, they set out a modest target, the complete liberation of Russia from President Putin, saying they won't stop until they reach Moscow.
These are the Russians fighting the Russians and delivering a big propaganda victory for Ukraine. That at least was the message presented, perched on top of their trophy of war.
We're fighting for freedom. We're fighting against injustice.
On Monday, these men drove across the border, claimed to occupy territory and captured a Russian armoured car. Now back in Ukraine, the same soldier told me it was a moment of glory he'd waited years for. But they are coy about how much help they've had from Ukraine.
Well, we definitely got a lot of encouragement.
Did they help you?
They did encourage us.
Did they help you?
They did encourage us.
The US has distanced itself from the raid. The West doesn't want its weapons used inside Russia.
This is a Russian AK.
I see all hands.
The one that we managed to get in the combat, so to say. So.
And then there's the politics of the group's leader, who's been called a far-right white supremacist.
Do you mind being described as a neo-Nazi?
I don't think it's an insult. This war starts, and all those bad neo-Nazis all of a sudden turn into what? Patriots, freedom fighters. So did anything change about us? No, everything changed about your perception.
How much their operation actually helps Ukraine's cause isn't at all clear. It is an embarrassment, a distraction for the Kremlin. But it also fits Vladimir Putin's narrative that this is a war for Russia's survival. For you, where does this war finish?
In Moscow.
Your war.
In Moscow. In Moscow, in my hometown.
In war, you can't always choose your friends, but these allies may not come cost-free. John Ray, News at 10, Eastern Ukraine.
Now, we have heard story after shocking story about the deep levels of misogyny in the Metropolitan Police. But even so, it was horrifying to hear one former female officer tell us today that colleagues would often say that if they were raped, they wouldn't bother reporting it. As a new recruit, Jess McDonald worked in the sexual offences team and told us today in her first television interview of the astonishing levels of sexism and bullying directed towards her and other female officers.
Jess McDonald was once proud to join Britain's largest police force, but after just 3 years in the Metropolitan Police, she quit.
It's demoralising. It's really, really demoralising because when you're in a broken system, you can try all you like, but there is this break in the system, and so I almost broke myself.
Fast-tracked as a detective in frontline policing, working in the rape and domestic violence units, she describes a force where bullying and sexism was rife and a criminal justice system which systematically failed women, particularly victims of rape.
You feel like you're fighting a raging fire with a water pistol, such as the sheer volume of the work. And so much of the work we did was futile, not because there wasn't evidence, not because a crime hadn't been committed, but because it just wouldn't be charged. And it was really, really demoralising to be the face of that for women. They'd put their faith and hope in me, and I was the face of, I was the person who said, I'm sorry, we're not taking any further action. I put this down to the CPS charging standards, and they want a realistic prospect of conviction. So they want, essentially, to win cases.
Also astonishing how even those investigating sexual offences felt failed. Jess says she doesn't know a single female officer in the unit who would report their own rape to the police.
I would hear colleagues sometimes say, oh, you know, if I got raped, I wouldn't report it. What's the point?
Crown Prosecution Service told us it undermines a fair justice system by charging cases that don't meet its legal test. But Jess's claims go beyond the treatment of victims to the treatment of female officers in the force, describing the predatory behaviour that she came across in police ranks when a colleague was photographed naked in the shower while staying in police accommodation through a glass panel above the shared bathroom door.
One of the officers used a phone to look at her while she was in the shower. She burst out and kind of almost caught him red-handed with the phone. He was about to join a rape team, so he would have headed up a rape team as the detective sergeant.
The officer was later convicted and dismissed. She joined the force full of hope of making a difference, but she left feeling helpless and frustrated. The Metropolitan Police told us no formal allegations of bullying were made and that they'd encourage Jess to come forward with more information. Sejal Karia, News at 10.
An utterly dispiriting story. Now, if you live in London or one of the other major cities, you will no doubt have seen police outriders aggressively bringing traffic to a halt to allow some dignitary or other free passage. It doesn't always improve your mood, particularly if you're sitting there for a while, but most of us probably accept it's necessary and proportionate. Or is it? The son of a woman who has died from injuries caused by a motorcycle outrider protecting Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, says the police killed her. Helen Holland was 81. She was hit crossing a busy road in West London nearly 2 weeks ago. Martin Holland said ordinary people should not be expendable to protect the chosen few. Sam Holder is beside the crossing point where she was hit. Sam, this is quite the criticism tonight, and I guess it does leave us wondering, you know, do these people always need this level of protection? Is it exercised proportionately? What have you found out?
Well, that's right, Tom. There's been fury from the family of Helen Holland. She suffered multiple broken bones and massive internal injuries in the crash here. And essentially what the family are calling for is an overhaul of how police escorts work. They want greater emphasis put on safeguarding the public, pedestrians, rather than just royals in their cars. Look, Tom, there are dozens of journeys like this every day in London alone, not just royals, but also MPs and foreign dignitaries. And although they feature some of the most highly trained officers in the country, they don't have to abide by red lights or speed limits. I actually spoke to a former protection officer who said that although the Duchess of Edinburgh may not be the most high-profile royal, she is considered extremely high risk as the sister-in-law of the king, and therefore the police take escorting her extremely seriously because the risk of attack is greatest when driving. Well, in a statement, the Duchess of Edinburgh said she sends her deepest sympathies to the family and will be in touch with them directly. Meanwhile, the Independent Office for Police Conduct is investigating exactly what led to the crash here.
OK, Sam, thank you very much indeed. People living in the blocks of flats that triggered our series of reports on Britain's housing crisis have tonight voted overwhelmingly to have all three pulled down and their homes completely rebuilt. It was 2 years ago that we filmed the damp, the mould and dangerous, absolutely dire conditions, to be blunt, inside the flats in Croydon in South London. The local council asked residents for their views in a ballot as it plans how to redevelop housing in the area. Now, Donald Trump won't, after all, be a shoo-in to take on Joe Biden in next year's presidential election. Mr. Trump's biggest rival for their Republican Party nomination, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, of course, is joining the contest. He filed the paperwork this evening and will make the announcement in the next hour.
Face of darkness, you can see that brighter.
No official announcement from Ron DeSantis just yet, but one or two expensively produced clues. His wife posted this on social media, her husband looking heroic before heading, we guess, to a presidential stage.
Every single time.
We'll be interviewing Ron DeSantis, and he has quite an announcement to make.
And then some even less subtle signposting from the billionaire Elon Musk, who'll be hosting DeSantis live on Twitter later tonight. Ron DeSantis is the arch-conservative governor of Florida, always keen not only to speak the language of the culture war.
Our bottom line is we do not surrender to the woke mob. Florida's where woke goes to die.
But also to enact it. He's passed legislation to restrict what can be taught about sexuality and gender identity in Florida's schools. He's also limited access to abortion, but made it easier to own a firearm.
Ron DeSantis, did anyone ever hear of DeSantis? The sanctimonious DeSantis.
Donald Trump used to be a big fan of his, but now they're rivals, not so much. Possibly because DeSantis carries a lot of Trumpian policies, but none of his baggage. He's a devoted family man, a veteran, and perhaps most significantly, no one's trying to send him to jail.
He believes that he will be president of the United States, and that is his goal. At the same time, I don't think he really ever thought that he would be competing against what we'll call King Kong, and DeSantis is now Godzilla, because these two are going to, it's going to be messy.
DeSantis has some tough campaigning to do if he's going to beat Trump to the Republican nomination, who is currently polling way ahead of him. Whether it's King Kong or Godzilla who eventually triumphs, the battle for the leadership of conservative America will be fought on hard right ground. Geraint Vincent, News at 10.
King Kong or Godzilla, the mind boggles. Now, the King and Queen Camilla chose to make their first major trip outside England since the coronation to Newton Abbey near Belfast. They were there for the opening of a coronation garden in the town's Hazelbank Park, complete with musical shrubbery, no less. Later, at a private meeting at Hillsborough, the King met Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell, who was recovering from a near-fatal gun attack in February. The Real Madrid teammates of the Brazilian striker Vinicius Jr have left no one in any doubt of their support for him over the racial abuse he was subjected to in their game last Sunday. The whole team lined up before tonight's home match wearing replicas of his number 20 shirt. Their message was to show there is no place for racism in Spanish football. To end tonight, a modern miracle, courtesy of some pretty cool science that has helped a paralysed man to stand and walk. 2 implants in his brain pick up his thoughts about moving his legs and pass them wirelessly in a Bluetooth kind of way to another implant in his damaged spine.
Okay, so you tell me when you're ready.
Learning to walk again 12 years after a cycling accident which left him paralysed. 40-year-old Gert-Jan Oscom is the first person in the world to get his mobility back thanks to electronic wizardry which bypasses his broken back, allowing his brainwaves to control his legs.
We've seen paralysed people walk before as a result of spinal implants, but this is the first time those movements are being controlled by the patient's thoughts instead of a computer. Scientists in Switzerland drilled into Gert-Jan's skull and inserted 2 electronic implants just above his brain. Another implant was attached to the nerve endings in his spine, which control his legs and feet. Using an AI algorithm, scientists were able to translate the brain signals wirelessly transmitted from his skull to make them into movement triggers. This so-called digital bridge transforming his thoughts into actions.
You have to learn how to correlate this brain signal to the spinal cord stimulation. But this is pretty short. In a few sessions, everything is linked and the patient starts training.
Within 5 to 10 minutes, the brain implant picked up what I was doing with my hip, so that was like the best outcome, I think, for everyone.
I only have to think about the movement and I can start and stop.
Research is in an early stage. The prototype is bulky and can't be worn permanently, but this is a significant step forward and will offer many hope for the future.
This is really the result of, I don't know how many person years of work around the world, but lots, and it shows the importance of research.
The kit is extremely expensive, but for Gert-Jan, the prospect of standing at a bar for a beer with friends is priceless. Martin Stew, News at 10.
I accept its early stages, but what an amazingly hopeful story about the miracles of modern science. Good place to end. Good night. Thanks for watching.